Does terrorism work? Does terrorism work? I want to make 4 brief points. The first point I want to make is that does terrorism work is an incredibly important question for each and every one of us as individuals, as members of society, and collectively as communities. Terrorism, and particularly responses to terrorism, have done much to shape the world politically, socially, in terms of how we live, how states deal with each other, how states and societies are organized internally, the kind of laws we live under, the kind of freedoms we live under or do not possess. All of this has been determined significantly by responses to terrorism. But we can't respond effectively to terrorism. We cannot respond in the most life-saving and effective ways unless we know the answer to the question I'm asking, unless we know what terrorism actually does achieve, unless we know exactly what terrorism does produce in terms of outcomes. If, for example, terrorism turns out from our research overwhelmingly to achieve its practitioners' central goals, or if our research suggests that terrorism overwhelmingly does not achieve the central goals of those who practice it, or if it turns out that terrorism is much more likely to work for certain causes than for others, or is far less likely to produce success in certain contexts, in certain circumstances, those are really important findings for all of us, of course for states, of course for governments, of course for police forces, for us as individuals, for us as voters, for us as members of society, for us about thinking about who we vote for and the kinds of life we want to live. So does terrorism work is a vital question for all of us. My second point is that does terrorism work is a very difficult question. It's difficult partly because it's such a painful topic to consider calmly. Here in Belfast, where I'm speaking, people on all sides of the community have suffered terribly as a consequence of terrorizing politically motivated violence. It's also a difficult question to answer because notoriously terrorism is a very difficult term to define. Huge contestation in terms of what it means. Is terrorism a term that's only applicable to violence directly targeting civilians, or should it be used more widely than that? Is terrorism a term that should only be applied to non-state violence, or should it relate to state violence also? Today's talk is about non-state terrorism, but I think a different talk could ask the question, does state terrorism work? Different dynamics, but equally important. So it's difficult to define the word which we're trying to analyze. It's also difficult to define the word working. Sometimes in this debate people talk past each other. Some people say, yes, it does work. Some people may say, no, it doesn't work, but they mean different things by working. So my first point is, does terrorism work, is a question I think we all need to have an answer to if we're going to think about how the world is shaped. My second point is, it's an incredibly difficult question. My third point is, how should we go about thinking about this question? How should we approach a serious understanding of this difficult and important topic? And I think we need to have a layered and careful definition of what working might mean. The answer yes or no isn't going to be persuasive, I think. It's too complicated a phenomenon for that. Terrorism could work in different ways. Terrorism could work in terms of strategic success. You could pursue a particular primary central goal or goals and achieve them. That would be strategic success. But it could work at a lower level in terms of what I would call partial strategic success, where you don't get your central primary goal or goals, but you get a diluted version of it. You might pursue full independence for a particular territory. You might not achieve that, but you might get partial independence for part of that territory. Not your full goal, but a non-trivial achievement in terms of partial strategic success. Partial strategic success could involve you getting your secondary goals. You might not get your primary goal, but you might get revenge against opponents. You might sustain resistance into the future for your cause. But there's another level as well as strategic and partial strategic success. You could have tactical successes. Even groups that do not achieve strategic victory might have operational successes in terms of particular actions. They might gain interim concessions, the release of prisoners, ransom payments for hostages. They might gain publicity for their causes. They might provoke states into undermining themselves through the reactions that states make. There might be a whole series of tactical level successes, which would be a different way of terrorism working. In addition to those levels, strategic, partial strategic, and tactical, there's also what I refer to as the inherent rewards of the activity. You might gain certain emotional, certain psychological, certain financial rewards. You might gain the shift from humiliating deference to proud defiance. You might gain excitement, you might gain comradeship. I don't think those things explain it, but I don't think they're trivial outcomes either. So my third point is we need to think in a careful way about what working might in complicated outcomes mean? So it's a really important question, I'm arguing. It's a really difficult question. We need to think about it in a layered way. Fourth and finally, what's the answer to the question? At the risk of giving you my answer and then meaning that none of you read my book on the subject, my attractively priced book on the subject, what I would say is that the answer to this seems to me on the basis of research to be as follows. Okay? Terrorism, historically, terrorism globally, very rarely achieves full strategic success. It's very rare that the full primary central goals are achieved. Much more common is that second level of outcome, where you get a diluted version of what you most want, or where you get secondary goals. Yes, the sustenance of resistance into the future. Yes, the achievement of revenge against opponents. Tactical successes are also more frequent than strategic ones. Operational successes, even groups that have been strategically very ineffective, have often had, with terrible consequences for the victims, operational successes. Terrorism has frequently produced high publicity. Terrorism has frequently persuaded states to do things which have undermined themselves, have provoked states into actions which have been delegitimizing. And while the inherent costs for terrorist involvement are obviously very high, imprisonment for some, the threat of lethal drone strikes for others, there have been repeated rewards in terms of emotional, psychological, and other kinds of things that people have got out of it. Now, that's not a pattern that fits every group. We're talking about terrorisms, not terrorism. It's not one pattern which will fit every group. But what I've just described, I think a very strong case on the basis of research could be made that that fits Al-Qaeda, that that fits the PLO, that that fits Hamas, that that fits FARC in Colombia in a different way that that fits ISIS, and that that fits some of the terrorisms which have happened in Northern Ireland and in Ireland from where I'm speaking today. What are the implications of this if I'm right? If I'm right, I would argue this has huge implications for all of us. If I'm right that terrorism very rarely achieves full strategic success, then states should focus less on that aspect of terrorism as a threat. States should not exaggerate the threat which terrorism represents, should not present it as being existential, because the overwhelming likelihood is that non-state terrorists are not going to get full strategic victory. One of the big problems states have often faced in terms of responding to terrorism is exaggerating its threat, overreacting often militarily, and making things substantially worse in cycles of escalatory violence. What I'm arguing is that if my argument is right, and terrorism very rarely achieves central primary goals, then states should respond in a more effective, proportionate, calibrated manner. States and societies should respond to what terrorism is likely to achieve. Terrorism will achieve publicity, high publicity locally, nationally, and globally. But there is what I would refer to as the paradox of terrorist publicity. Yes, terrorism gains high publicity, but it normally gains publicity for acts which most observers find repellent, especially if the victims are civilian. That's a huge resource in trying to limit the incidence of bloodstained violence of this kind. Yes, terrorism often achieves the sustenance of resistance into the future, so states should not say we're going to rid the world of this evil and make unachievable promises. States should focus on what can be achieved, which is containment rather than extirpation, and life-saving activity rather than unfulfillable obligations. Yes, terrorism often provokes states, including liberal democracies, to react in ways which undermine those liberal democracies, changing the ways in which we deal with freedoms, changing the ways in which we deal with prisoners, changing the restraints which we normally approach looking after prisoners with and suspects with. There's no necessity to do that. It's a choice that we as societies make in terms of politicians, in terms of those whom we elect, in terms of what we will tolerate. But those are ways in which terrorism is made more effective by the choices that states make. And most importantly, in conclusion, what I would suggest is that if I'm right that terrorism is a bloodstained symptom of much deeper motivations and conflicts, if terrorism is something which people pursue because they think that is the best or the only way of achieving really important political change and political goals. And if I'm right that historically and globally it turns out not to be a very successful way of achieving central primary goal or goals, we need to stress that. We need to stress the overwhelming inefficacy of terrorism in terms of major political change. Terrorism is far more likely to cause human suffering than it is to achieve the high-sounding goals which are at the heart of the causes for which it is practiced. And we need particularly to demonstrate that there are effective, viable, available, non-violent ways of pursuing major political change. If our reaction to the question, does terrorism work, and if I hope I persuaded you in this short talk that my understanding of the answer to that question is as I've set it out, then we can, if our reaction to it is then to say that we can demonstrate that terrorism is not going to be the most effective way of pursuing political change, and can demonstrate as societies, and can commit ourselves as individuals and political communities to show that there are non-violent ways of pursuing the political change that people want to see, then we will have been able to rethink the future and rethink ways in which we can respond to this challenge, ways in which we can respond to this tactic, to this threat, which might have life-saving implications for many of us across the next century. Thank you very much indeed.